I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had spent his life believing Balmoral represented something immovable: family, inheritance, and the private world his mother guarded until her final days. Then a sealed royal archive file was placed before him, and that certainty collapsed. The document did not merely mention Catherine. It established that Queen Elizabeth had personally directed that control of the Balmoral estate pass to the Princess of Wales, leaving her eldest son confronting a decision he never expected to read. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the decisive passage twice. The royal archive, the protected collection where royal records are preserved, had authenticated the file after matching signatures, dates, and estate instructions. Balmoral mattered because it was never simply another royal address. The Scottish estate had carried Somers, traditions, and the Queen's final chapter. Now the record stated that Elizabeth had left its controlling personal interest to Catherine, rather than to her son. He lowered the pages onto the table and said nothing. Catherine received the same confirmation elsewhere and felt no victory. The Princess of Wales, William's wife and a working member of the family, understood that the inheritance carried more than land or status. It touched Charles's memories of his mother and William's memories of his grandmother. She reread the wording, then asked whether the king had already seen it. When told that he had, she closed the copy without another question. Whatever Elizabeth intended, Catherine knew this could wound 2 generations at once. Charles forced himself back to the document. The signed instruction was explicit. The transfer was deliberate, permanent, and not a clerical mistake. An archive official remained across the table as the monarch studied the signature he knew so well. Then another line changed the mood. The file referenced a second sealed attachment, written to explain why Elizabeth had chosen Catherine, yet that attachment was missing from the material before him. Charles looked up and demanded that it be produced. The silence grew heavier. Charles closed the folder, pushed his chair back, and finally asked the question beneath all the legal language. Why had his mother never told him herself? The official could not answer. Catherine, meanwhile, had no idea that her name had been tied to a judgment Elizabeth had made years earlier. And when that missing explanation surfaced, the king would discover that Balmoral was only the surface of the decision. But the answer would hurt far more once Charles understood that Elizabeth's decision was not simply about Balmoral. It was about the people she trusted to protect what came after her. For Catherine, the inheritance felt less like a gift than a burden placed directly between father and son. William understood immediately what Balmoral meant to Charles, yet he also knew his grandmother rarely made permanent decisions without purpose. Behind closed doors, 3 people now carried 3 different forms of pain: a king facing rejection, a future king caught between generations, and a princess wondering why Elizabeth had entrusted the estate to her at all. William entered Catherine's room without aids, and found the archive copy still unopened on the table. She had spent years learning how royal pressure worked. First as a newcomer watched closely by the public, then as a wife, mother, and senior member of the family carrying increasingly serious duties. The Princess of Wales was the title given to the wife of the heir to the throne, but Elizabeth had judged Catherine by more than position. She had watched how the younger woman handled scrutiny, protected her children, and stayed steady when private family tensions became public storms. Now that quiet trust had turned into something Catherine had never asked to possess. Catherine looked at William and made her position clear. She would not celebrate Balmoral. She would not discuss ownership. She would not even open Elizabeth's private explanation until Charles had been given the complete archive record first. William understood why. For him, Balmoral held childhood memories of his grandmother, but for his father, it represented something deeper: continuity with the woman whose reign had shaped almost his entire life. If Charles believed Elizabeth had deliberately passed him over, no legal explanation could immediately remove that wound. Charles felt that wound with every step. He walked alone after receiving the news, thinking less about land, buildings, or financial value than about one unbearable fact. His mother had apparently made a final decision about Balmoral without him. The king could accept duty. He could accept disagreement. What he struggled to accept was silence. Elizabeth had known how much the estate meant to him, and yet she had left him no personal warning. William soon learned the arrangement was more complicated than simple ownership. Elizabeth had placed conditions around Catherine's control, preventing Balmoral from being casually sold, divided, or treated as ordinary private property. Then another archive notation appeared. The Queen had personally amended those conditions after a private family incident years earlier. William read the date twice. Catherine finally looked toward the unopened file. Charles still did not know what had happened on that date, but the archive did. That act of restraint might have softened the king. Had the archive not also preserved the exact moment when Elizabeth decided Charles could no longer be the only guardian of Balmoral's future? Years before the archive was opened, one private evening at Balmoral altered the future without anyone realizing it. There was no public announcement, no family summit, and no dramatic declaration. There was simply Queen Elizabeth listening while a disagreement unfolded around the future of the estate she loved most. By the end of that night, something in her had hardened. Days later, she summoned a trusted legal advisor and ordered an amendment that would eventually leave Charles shattered. Elizabeth had always treated Balmoral differently from the palaces attached to royal duty. It was private family property, meaning it belonged personally to the sovereign, rather than functioning simply as an official residence of the crown. That distinction mattered deeply to her. Balmoral was where children grew up beyond ceremony, where family habits survived away from public pressure, and where she believed future generations should remember that royalty was not supposed to consume every part of their lives. Charles challenged that idea during a private Balmoral dinner in August 2019. He argued that the estate's future needed to remain firmly under the sovereign's personal direction, because control from the top protected continuity. Catherine answered carefully, but she did not retreat. George, Charlotte, and Louis, she said, should inherit Balmoral's family traditions, regardless of which one carried the greatest title in adulthood. The Queen heard the difference immediately. Her son was speaking about authority. Catherine was speaking about belonging. Elizabeth said almost nothing while the disagreement continued. Later, she asked Catherine to remain behind after the others had gone. The monarch questioned her quietly about what Balmoral should mean to children growing up under royal pressure. Catherine answered without speaking about ownership. She said its real value was giving them one place where family mattered more than position, where a future king and his siblings could still feel like grandchildren, cousins, brothers, and sisters, before they became symbols. The Queen placed her teacup down. Buildings survived easily, she told Catherine. Families did not. 3 days later, Elizabeth summoned her solicitor and ordered a revised private estate instruction. A solicitor is a lawyer who prepares and advises on legal documents, and this one was directed to name Catherine as Balmoral's future custodian. Beside the amendment, the monarch added a handwritten note. Preservation required someone capable of separating possession from power. Catherine never asked for the estate. Charles never knew that conversation had reshaped its future. But the archive preserved both the date and the reason. And when Charles discovers that those words became the foundation of his mother's final decision, restraint gives way to the confrontation everyone had feared. Charles did not summon Catherine as sovereign to subject. He asked to see her as a son who believed his mother had delivered one final judgment after death. No aides remained in the room. No official minutes were taken. When Catherine entered, the archive file was already waiting between them. What followed was not an argument about acres, titles, or money. It was a painful confrontation over loyalty, memory, and whether Elizabeth had stopped trusting her own son. Charles had now read the 2019 amendment and the documented account of Elizabeth's private conversation with Catherine. The amendment was a formal change to the late Queen's estate instructions, and its importance was brutal. It showed that her decision had developed over time rather than appearing at the end by accident. Catherine understood the danger immediately. One defensive answer could turn the king's grief into resentment, and that resentment could pull William into a conflict between his wife and his father. Charles did not circle around the question. He asked whether she had known Elizabeth intended to leave Balmoral under her control. Catherine answered at once. No, she had never been told. The king watched her closely, then admitted what had been crushing him since the archive opened. Being excluded did not feel like losing property. It felt like receiving his mother's criticism after her death, when he could no longer challenge her, explain himself, or ask what he had done wrong. Catherine felt the weight of that admission and finally shared something she had never understood before. During a private conversation years earlier, Elizabeth had asked whether she could protect Balmoral even from future royal pressure. Catherine had assumed the question was philosophical, perhaps even a test of character. She had never connected it to ownership. Charles reached for the handwritten archive note and placed it beside the older conversation record. The language matched. His mother's warning about separating possession from power suddenly had a living witness. Catherine reached toward the folder, then stopped before touching it. She told Charles that if keeping Balmoral destroyed the family Elizabeth wanted protected, she would relinquish it immediately. The king did not answer at first. Her offer stripped away the easiest explanation, that ambition had driven any of this. Then Charles asked the question that changed the confrontation completely. Who actually had the authority to enforce his mother's decision? And if the king objected, who could overturn it? Charles now knew Catherine did not take Balmoral from him. But discovering who truly controls the inheritance will force the king to confront a power even he cannot casually command. A crown can command ceremony, appointments, and enormous influence, but it cannot automatically erase a dead woman's private instructions. That reality lands heavily on Charles when advisors explain the mechanism Elizabeth placed around Balmoral. Catherine was not simply named on a sentimental note. Her position had been protected through a carefully drafted private estate arrangement, supported by trustees whose duty was to enforce the late Queen's wishes rather than satisfy the reigning monarch's emotions. Charles listened without interrupting as the senior advisor explained what that protection meant. Estate trustees are people legally responsible for carrying out written property instructions exactly as they were left, rather than changing them to satisfy family pressure or royal preference. Elizabeth had used that structure deliberately. Catherine was named as Balmoral's long-term custodian, but the estate was also protected for future generations. The arrangement was not designed to hand her a prize. It was designed to prevent Balmoral from becoming one. The king removed his glasses and placed them carefully beside the document. Then he asked the question everyone in the room had been expecting. Could his mother's instruction be undone? The advisor hesitated only briefly before answering. No, not without breaking the structure Elizabeth had intentionally created. Worse still, any challenge from Charles could appear less like a legal disagreement and more like a son fighting the final wishes of his dead mother. The monarch looked back at the page, frustration tightening around every word. Camilla noticed the change when the briefing ended. She waited until the advisors were gone before asking what was truly hurting him. Was it losing control of Balmoral, or knowing Elizabeth had chosen someone else to protect it? The Queen Consort did not soften the question. Charles admitted the difference was becoming harder to separate. He could accept legal limits. What he could not yet accept was the feeling that his mother had trusted Catherine with something she no longer trusted him to carry. Then, another clause was read. Catherine could not sell Balmoral for personal profit, divide it for convenience, or remove it from the family's long-term use. Elizabeth had also guaranteed access for her descendants, and buried beneath those protections was the detail that stopped Charles cold. He had been granted lifetime family access. His mother had never intended to push him away. She had protected his connection, while deliberately separating that connection from final control. Camilla watched him absorb the meaning. For the first time, the king was forced to confront a possibility he had resisted from the beginning. Perhaps Elizabeth had not taken Balmoral from him at all. The legal battle ended almost before it could begin, but the emotional consequences were only starting, and Balmoral itself would become the place where those consequences finally became real. The first consequences are almost invisible. No gates are locked. No family member is expelled. Yet everything feels different, because everyone now knows whose name carries Elizabeth's authority over Balmoral's future. Charles arrives carrying decades of memory into a house he can still enter, but no longer emotionally regards as unquestioningly his. Catherine arrives later, equally uncomfortable, realizing that possession on paper can create distance inside a family before anyone says a word. Catherine begins receiving practical estate briefings almost immediately, but she refuses to behave like someone taking command. An estate briefing is simply a formal review of how a property is managed, from staff and maintenance to land, finances, and long-term responsibilities. She rejects unnecessary changes and insists that Elizabeth's routines remain untouched wherever possible. William supports her caution and carefully avoids any language suggesting that his wife has won Balmoral. He understands that one careless phrase could turn grief into humiliation. Charles feels that danger more deeply when he enters a familiar private sitting room. He stops before taking the chair long associated with his mother and hesitates in a way he never would have before the archive revelation. The room has not changed. His memories have. Balmoral once represented continuity without question. But now every familiar corner seems connected to a decision Elizabeth made beyond his knowledge. The king finally sits, yet the comfort he expected does not come. Catherine notices his unease and makes another quiet choice. Her first formal estate meeting is postponed. She refuses to force Charles to watch her assume responsibilities while he is still absorbing what they mean. William backs the decision immediately, telling her that restraint will matter more than authority in these first days. She agrees, but the delay creates a new tension. Balmoral cannot remain suspended forever. Then an aide brings Catherine something no briefing had mentioned. Elizabeth left one final sealed instruction with a condition attached. It could only be opened after Catherine physically returned to Balmoral following confirmation of the inheritance. She asks the aide to leave the envelope untouched. Then she notices the name written beside hers. Charles. The letter is addressed to them both. Catherine walks directly to him and explains what has been found. The king says nothing at first. She does not open it alone. Instead, she asks him to read it with her, without advisors, trustees, or anyone else in the room. For the first time since the archive was opened, Elizabeth appears to be speaking directly to both of them. Everything now rests on what she placed inside that envelope, because the next words from the past will either deepen the king's wound or finally explain it. There are no lawyers when the envelope is opened. No palace secretaries, no advisors translating emotion into protocol. Only Charles, Catherine, and words written by a woman they both loved differently. The letter does not apologize for the decision. Elizabeth explains it. She tells her son that Balmoral was never withheld because he had failed her. She entrusted its future to Catherine because Charles already carried something heavier, the crown, and she refused to make every family memory another burden of kingship. Charles reads the first lines in silence, then passes the letter across when the words become harder to carry alone. Catherine understands immediately why Elizabeth insisted they open it together. The crown is not simply a symbol here, it means the full weight of kingship, including constitutional duty, public service, ceremony, and responsibility that follows the sovereign everywhere. Elizabeth had feared that Balmoral would slowly become another extension of that burden. She wanted one place where family memory could survive without being swallowed by office. The king becomes visibly shaken as Catherine continues. Elizabeth writes that she had watched her son carry responsibility for decades and worried that kingship would eventually make him responsible for too much. Charles does not interrupt. That sentence hurts because it changes the meaning of everything he believed. He had read the inheritance as rejection. His mother had written it as protection. Catherine struggles when the letter turns toward her. Elizabeth describes her as someone capable of keeping Balmoral within the family before keeping it within the institution. The words connect directly to the documented account of their 2019 conversation, when Catherine argued that George, Charlotte, and Louis should know the estate as family before understanding it as royal inheritance. The Queen had remembered that answer. More than that, she had built her decision around it. Then the letter becomes unmistakably personal. Elizabeth asks Catherine never to use Balmoral to diminish Charles, never to let ownership become a weapon, and never to confuse stewardship with superiority. She asks her son, in turn, never to mistake delegation for rejection. The choice was not against him. It was designed around him. Catherine finishes reading and says nothing. Charles takes the letter back, folds it slowly, and finally admits what had consumed him for days. He thought his mother had chosen Catherine against him. Now he understands she had chosen her for the family. That realization softens the wound, but it does not solve what comes next. The inheritance can no longer remain private. Their understanding changes the story inside Balmoral. But outside its walls, the archive revelation is about to explode into public view. By morning, what had been an intensely private family reckoning becomes national conversation. The inheritance is no longer confined to archive rooms or Balmoral corridors. Broadcasters debate Elizabeth's intentions. Commentators turn Catherine into a symbol of royal succession before she has said a word. Charles is portrayed as wounded, sidelined, even rejected. Yet one image begins cutting through the noise. The king and princess emerging from the same Balmoral meeting, calm, united, and refusing to perform the feud everyone expects. Catherine feels the pressure immediately. The archive confirmation dominates royal coverage because Balmoral is not just valuable property. It carries Elizabeth's deepest family associations and now appears tied to her judgment about the monarchy's future. Palace communications refuse to challenge the document. Instead, officials prepare to stress that the estate remains available for family use. A palace acknowledgement is simply an official statement confirming the institution's position. And every word matters, because one careless sentence could make private pain look like open war. Charles sees the headlines turning his mother's decision into humiliation. Catherine sees something worse. She fears the public story will paint him as a rejected son, while casting her as the woman who displaced him. She drafts a statement that minimizes her role and emphasizes his importance to Balmoral. Then she takes it to him herself. The king reads the page in silence, reaches for a pen, and crosses out the apologetic language. Charles looks at her and makes the choice she does not expect. There is nothing for her to apologize for. She did not ask Elizabeth for Balmoral. She did not manipulate the arrangement, and she will not be blamed simply because the late queen trusted her with a responsibility. Catherine hears the anger of earlier days disappearing from his voice. For the first time, he is protecting her from the story instead of protecting himself from the decision. Outside Buckingham Palace, the public reaction becomes impossible to ignore. A crowd gathers as broadcasters repeat the archive revelation, while newsstands carry one front page showing Catherine beside Balmoral, beneath the stark headline, "The Queen's Final Trust." The phrase spreads because it captures the emotional question at the center of everything. Why her? The palace prepares its answer. Elizabeth established a family stewardship arrangement, it confirms, designed to preserve Balmoral for future generations. But Charles decides that official wording is no longer enough. The estate had begun as an inheritance nobody knew how to accept. Now Charles prepares to transform it into something neither the archive nor the headlines could dictate. A family decision made in the present. Charles could not change what his mother had written, but by the end, he no longer wanted to. The revelation that first felt like a final rejection becomes something very different. Proof that Elizabeth had divided responsibility according to the people she believed could carry it best. Charles had inherited the crown. Catherine had been entrusted with Balmoral's private future. And when the king finally accepts that distinction openly, the crisis stops being a story about what he lost and becomes one about what his mother tried to preserve. Charles makes the decision without another legal challenge. He formally recognizes Catherine's stewardship and confirms that Elizabeth's archived estate instructions will stand exactly as she intended. Stewardship means holding responsibility for something on behalf of others, rather than treating it as a personal prize. And that distinction now matters more than ownership itself. Catherine commits to keeping Balmoral as a multi-generational family home, preserving access for the king, William, their children, and the wider descendants Elizabeth wanted protected. The king speaks to Catherine privately before the final arrangement is settled. He tells her Balmoral must never become evidence of division between them. The traditions his mother guarded, the gatherings, the routines, the sense of refuge from royal pressure, must survive beyond the legal language that caused so much pain. Catherine answers without hesitation. She will never treat the estate as simply hers. She will treat herself as its guardian, responsible for keeping the family inside it rather than keeping anyone out. William hears that answer and finally feels the tension lift. The prince had spent days caught between his father's grief and his wife's unwanted inheritance, knowing one wrong move could harden the conflict for years. Now he watches them reach the understanding Elizabeth had been trying to create. Charles carries the monarchy. Catherine protects the family sanctuary. Neither role needs to diminish the other. Charles finally understands the choice that shattered him at the beginning. Elizabeth was never deciding which royal deserved Balmoral more. She was separating monarchical responsibility from family stewardship. Before leaving, the king places his mother's letter into Catherine's hands instead of sending it back to the archive. He tells her to keep it at Balmoral, where Elizabeth meant its promise to be fulfilled. The archive had shattered Charles because, at first, he saw only what Elizabeth had not left him. In the end, he understood what she had left behind instead. A crown for her son, a sanctuary for her family, and Catherine entrusted with protecting the fragile boundary between them. Balmoral did not become the symbol of a king's rejection. It became Elizabeth's final act of faith, and Charles's acceptance of that truth finally made the inheritance whole. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.